think one of the most surprising things that I have had among the classes that take this is an understanding of how large the movement is in contemporary Christianity and how far its outreach was. Not that it's the biggest by any means. We're still small, but I want you to see that out of this revival came the seventh largest religious tradition. This is without including Pentecostalism. I want to state very clearly now, it is my thesis. Some people make Pentecostalism an outgrowth of the holiness churches. That is not true, except for the qualifications I will make when we get to it. Basically, Pentecostalism in its full breadth and spread came out of the same revival milieu, which is the word I like to use, mix. In other words, one group took a more Methodist approach, an historical approach. The other group, as we said before, took a more eschatological look to the future. They believed that Pentecostalism was the last great revival before the Lord came back. And we're going to discuss that mix when we get into discussing it. A lot of Pilgrim Holiness people believe it. A lot of Wesleyans believe that. But basically, in there is the dividing line. So keeping the Pentecostals out, and I'll put the Pentecostals in eventually so you can see, we're talking now about the Holiness Revival in the 19th century, which is part of the main revival in America. Let's see what traditions we have. I'm going to give you some rather old statistics because we don't have any better. There were 802,500,000 Roman Catholics around the world in 1980, according to Barrett, B-A-R-R-A-T-T. He is a man who tried to get together all the statistics on Christians everywhere in the world, how many there were in different traditions. First time anybody's ever been able to do that with any reasonable in-the-park figures. They're in the park. These are not hard and fast. But he is do that with any reasonable in-the-park figures. They're in the park. These are not hard and fast. But he is now redoing his book, by the way, bringing it up to date. He did it in 1970, and then he made predictions for 1980, and now he is doing it over again, and we'll see what he comes up with. But he predicted that the Roman Catholics would be 802,500,000. The Protestants would be 262 million all around the world. Now, those are your big two classes, Roman Catholic, Protestant, in the Christian tradition. Now, of the Protestant traditions, Lutheranism, here's your Lutheranism. Lutheranism is about 42 million people. Now, I hope that you all understand what that means. This means baptized people who may never have entered the church ever in Roman Catholic tradition. There's so many non-practicing Catholics, as they call themselves, non-practicing and practicing. In other words, it means they were baptized a Catholic. Many of these are in countries where the Catholic Church is the official church of the country. So that has to be taken into account. These people are much the same. There are many in here, Protestants, like Germany, where the Evangelical Lutheran Church is still the established church, and the Reformed Church of Germany. The state pays for all their pastors. They tax and pay for all their pastors. So you've got 42 million. That merely means that if you were born in Germany, or if you were born in Sweden or Scandinavia, you were baptized a Lutheran. So there are 42 million baptized Lutheran, although many of those people never entered a Lutheran church except to get baptized. But we don't know. There's no way to distinguish it, so we count them as Lutheran. Now, the Reformed tradition, which is the other great Reformation tradition, is 37 million, almost the same. Now, they're also in the countries of Europe where the official church is still these churches. Now, around the world, the Baptists are the next. And this is all Baptists, not particularly Southern or any other. 33,500,000. And again, these are very... The Methodists, not including the Holiness people, although we are part of the Methodist Council, the World Methodist Council, not the National Council, but we are a member of the Methodist Church Council. All our major holiness bodies are the Wesleyans, the Nazarenes, and the Frees are still related somehow to that. Is 33.5 million. So you see, these two traditions are pretty well the same. The Pentecostals, this is both Wesleyan and non-Wesleyan. We'll talk about Pentecostalism and their relationship. And this figure I know is way off, 22 million. Pentecostalism has had quite an explosion since 1980. So it's much larger than that. The Disciples of Christ, which is another American church, the Carmelites as they were called, the Churches of Christ, the disciples, are 8.5 million. And here we are. The holiness tradition, including the Salvation Army, is 9.5 million. Now, we count these two out. These are the big classifications. Let's take these out. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. In 1970, when he did this work, Barrett predicted that the Holiness Movement was the 7th major tradition in Protestant Christianity. You notice that he predicted that the Holiness Movement would surpass the disciples by 1980, which moves, if we follow his predictions, it's the only thing we really got to work with for whatever it's worth and whatever it means. The holiness tradition is the 6th major tradition in Protestantism. And that all comes out of the revival which we have just talked about. It's all a result of that movement through history in Methodism. Now, there are many problems, always in church statistics, there's a lot of problems. How many do you have out in church? Oh, about 400 or 500, and if you count them, you may have 175 to 250. We have a tendency to be evangelistically expansive in our statistics, and we try to squeeze every member in so it'll look good in the minutes for the next year. So generally, statisticians look upon church statistics as being rather unreliable. There's more than that to it, though, and some of us have been leaders in this movement and have pretty well won the battle. The simple fact is that in holiness churches, we would do better to take the Sunday morning population, which is just as much a part of the church as the membership population in most of your larger churches. I know this for Methodism because I have figures to back it up. If you took the 33.5 million in Methodism, on any given Sunday, at least in the American church, if you use American statistics, about only 3 out of every 10 of those will be in church on any given morning. So you can figure out what that would be. About 11 some million people out of 33 million would be influenced by the church on a regular basis, what we call overall constituency. On the other hand, if you take a holiness or Pentecostal or an evangelical Baptist church or any of those, you will find out that many people come to that church who have not affiliated with it but are as regular or more regular than many of the people who are members here by far. That's why church statistics are so slippery. And that's all we got if we want to get some idea of where we are in our traditions. But let's not make too much of it. As far as my point here, it is that I find that many holiness people come from small holiness churches, you see, in small towns, and they feel isolated and lonely as if they're the only ones in the world. It's a little bit like the prophet. Am I the only one left in Israel? No, there are 7,000. They've not bowed their knee to Baal. You just don't know them. And so, you see, it's one of the significant traditions in Christendom, and is especially significant for the revival. If you take out a Wesleyan holiness aspect, if you would take the Pentecostals who are Wesleyan holiness and put them in with the holiness people, which is really where they belong, because their doctrine of holiness is the same as ours. They believe in Wesleyan holiness, but they add the baptism for power, and which is shown by tongues, the Spirit baptism, which we'll get into. So what I'm trying to say is there's different ways of changing these, but nevertheless a conservative figure. And 2 million of these, or 2.5 million, by the way, are Salvation Army. Salvation Army is the largest holiness group around the world. The Nazarenes are the largest holiness group in the United States. And I want to look at that next. And I just checked these figures against the 99 yearbook, and they're pretty accurate. I had made estimates on this for an overhead, and I'm going to keep the estimates because they're nice and round and are probably about as accurate as the ones that are printed. But they do contrast different movements. The Church of the Nazarene, now this is just in the United States. Church of the Nazarene, about 750,000 people in 1999. No, it's 1998. I used the 99 yearbook, so it'd be 98. So this is 2 years ago. The Salvation Army in the United States is about 500,000. I'm putting them in order of size. The Church of God, I'll use the Greek term here, the Church of God, Anderson, Indiana. The Church of God, Anderson, Indiana, is about 250,000. The Wesleyan Church in the States is about 120,000. The Free Methodist Church in the States, much smaller than it is overseas, it's bigger overseas than the States, is 80,000. The Missionary Church, a holiness body, of course connected with Bethel and Fort Wayne, Indiana, is 50,000. Now, below that, I have not estimated figures, but let me give you the churches. Now, I probably can give them just as well by giving them to you verbally and letting you get them down, because I think you're obviously going to catch them. The Evangelical Congregational Church, which is very big in this area, and their seminary out in Myerstown, some of our people have gone there for seminary work, is a holiness church. The Churches of Christ and Christian Union is a very active holiness church and has supplied quite a few leaders to the movement. A smaller church, but nevertheless one of the holiness churches. Churches of Christ and Christian Union. The Evangelical Methodist Church. The Evangelical Church of North America. This is the evangelicals that did not go with the merger of the evangelicals and the Methodists in 1968. They did not take part in that merger because of they believed they would lose their holiness distinctives. The Brethren in Christ Church, which is the Messiah group, and Upland. At one time they had a college at Upland in California. The Primitive Methodists, whom a lot of people don't know about, they are an English group that's over here. In fact, they have a church in Allentown. We used to train quite a number of their students at our school here, United Wesleyan. The Evangelical Friends, that's your Quaker group that I've been talking about. And by the way, they probably ought to be listed as by number because they have upwards of 40,000 members. They're quite a significant group. And we ought to note that. And then I include, of course, because there's a lot of the holiness tradition still in it, the CMA of 350,000 members. They're about the same size as the Church of God Anderson, just a little bigger. And then several rather significant groups that are black groups out of American black origin. The Church of Universal Triumph of the Dominion of God. That's a holiness church, a black holiness church, Wesleyan holiness. The Church of Universal Triumph, the Dominion of God. 75,000 members. And then the Church of God Holiness, not the Anderson group, the Church of God Holiness is a black group with 40,000 members. And the Church of God Holiness USA is a black group with 18,000 members. Now, those are the major holiness bodies. A lot of smaller ones that are still in existence from the beginning of the tradition. Now, let me show you what happens here, though. We have no ways identified the number of Methodists who still consider themselves holiness people, faithful to the tradition and who preach it and live it and try to promote it. And that we don't know. We have no way to really identify them. So out of that Methodist figure there, you could have pulled a whole bunch of people down into the tradition, especially in Methodism. There are people in the Baptist church. When I wrote my book on the history of the Holiness Movement, they invited me over to Southern Baptist Seminary in Louisville to talk to the faculty about it. And their leading theologian said, people that teach this doctrine in our church can get printed quicker than I can. He wasn't complaining, he was being kind of funny. But he basically agreed with what I had done, and he said, in the Baptist tradition, there is still a holiness, second blessing, higher life tradition. And I should mention the evangelist from the Holiness Revival of the Baptists, which is responsible for a lot of that. A.B. Earl. Of course, you have to get my book and read it, all of you. But then you'll have all of these names. But A.B. Earl was an American Baptist, which is your Northern Baptist, and was the only Baptist before the Civil War when the Baptist Church split and the Southern Baptist Church started. A.B. Earl traveled in his lifetime about 350,000 miles right before the turn of the century and not the turn of the century, the middle of the century, and right around 1850, 1860, had tremendous revivals. And he called, his word for the holiness experience was the second rest, from Hebrews. There is a rest for the people of God. The second rest. He preached all over. The largest group next to Methodism, which formed the Holiness Movement, were Baptists. Now, a lot of people don't realize that. My friend down at Wake Forest University, which is and seminaries, Baptist seminary, Bill Leonard, I've tried to get him to get somebody interested in writing a dissertation and do research on that factor. A lot of people came out of the Baptist movement into the Methodist holiness tradition and became part of the tradition. So these are the figures in which we place ourselves with a lot of reservations as to their total accuracy, but it gives you a relative idea of where these traditions stand. Okay.
Dr. Dieter, the African American Methodist churches, AME, AMEZ, CME, are any of them holiness?
Yes. In the same sense, if not a little more strongly than Methodism, putting them in their total context, and of course some of them are into millions of members, but they have a very strong holiness tradition in the African Methodist Episcopal. And some of the evangelists, the women evangelists particularly, of the Holiness Movement were black evangelists, the most famous of which was Amanda Smith. Amanda Smith, her biography is available. I think it's still reprinted. She was a black AME evangelist that was used all throughout the holiness tradition. I'll mention her when we get to Hannah Whitehall Smith because there's no connection on the Smith. But nevertheless, she and Hannah Whitehall Smith went to England together to the revivals over there. And she went all around the world. And we're going to discuss her a little bit under that period, Keswick period. Any further question on that? Okay. Yes, but it's hard to identify them, but the tradition is there, and they had exposure to the Wesleyan tradition, and they basically espouse it in their statements. All I know is, this wasn't Methodist, though. I spoke on this at a Methodist camp meeting, and there was a black woman there from the Abyssinian Baptist Church in New York, which is one of the larger Baptist churches. And she kind of said, that's exactly what we believe. So all scattered throughout Protestantism, just like with charismatic Pentecostalism, there are those people who say, yes, this is the way to talk about the Christian life. In other words, they recognize it. On the first Sunday at Ocean Grove, Tony Campolo, who is quite a favorite over there, Tony preached the most thoroughgoing holiness second blessing message you'd ever want to hear. and had 400 people out at the altar. So, you see, it's a revival movement. It surges up here, and somebody reads a book, and somebody hears a testimony, and somebody studies the Bible and sees this. And so it's a constant, ongoing thing. We are talking just about the main surge of the revival, which kind of shaped it up. But it'll never die as long as people try to be biblical Christians. Because in England, one of the words which the Salvation Army or the Methodists used was a Bible Christian movement, which was a split off of Wesleyanism. In Methodism in England, they call themselves the Bible Christians. So as long as people are Bible Christians, of which there are a lot in different denominations, there's going to be, because, out of experience and out of Scripture, you somehow have to deal with the fact that a Christian has to be a Christian, and whether he can be or whether she can't be, in life. Not like the Methodist minister that said, don't ever look at me, I'm going to run because I'm not a very good example. Now, we could feel that we are poor examples of what we could be in grace. We have to do that, and we are. But to say that you can't see Christ in my life somewhere is a pretty poor admission for a Christian. So that's always there, without being proud of what you have done. But if you think that Christ cannot reveal himself in us, then there's not much use of his being in us. Then we might as well go back to the old, my name's on the roll in heaven, I'm baptized, let's wait till we die. I mean, that's the antinomianism which Wesley fought, which he said was logical. If we don't really press for this, then the alternative, at its worst, is we say, well, it doesn't matter. I'm saved, I can't be lost, it doesn't matter. And some people go to that extreme. But Bible Christians don't. Billy Graham would say, the one logical answer that can come out of Calvinism on this is, Billy Graham would say, that person was never a Christian. That's what he would say about the question. But I think that's still begging the question, because if you go to the Hebrews texts, which are the strongest in the Bible on this question, I think that the possibility of losing one's salvation if one pushes it that far is definitely there. It's not easy to do. God doesn't give us up easily. But God can come to a point like he did with Adam where it doesn't work anymore. In the same way. And Adam was much more perfect than we are. Yes, Keith. Right.
If church historians and yourself included would make the 19th century the Methodist century, the 20th century the Baptist century, are you willing to venture the options, multiple choice at least, of what the 21st century might be?
A little doubt about that.
I thought so.
Pentecostal. Charismatic. Yeah, a little doubt about that. It's already, since we're talking statistics, and I don't want to get off too far on this because we have to move on in our story, but the Pentecostals claim, and I don't mean it's a wild claim, but they claim there are 500 million of these people that are Pentecostals out of this bunch. Some of them in denominations, such as I have the wrong bunch up here now, but when we had them listed, the traditions, they would claim that out of that number, that 500 million of them practice a kind of charismatic approach to Christianity. And there's no doubt that already, look at what's happening in South America and particularly, but all around the world. It's still a very vigorous movement. And we're going to talk a lot about that when we get down to the questions of the relationship of our churches. All right. I don't know, I keep tacking little things on to some of these issues because they'll get lost along the line. I came across a verse some years ago which was a great revelation to me. I'd never seen it before, in which it's said, I believe, I can't place it, and I believe it's the Apostle Paul, but it says, when he saw the grace of God among them, he encouraged them. And I thought to myself, Dieter, what would the church be like if that was the first approach to somebody who's a little different from us, but in whom the grace of God is working? Well, I don't know. I haven't answered that question. But I just know that it opened my eyes to the fact that our business as Christians is finding where God's working and then be sure we get in step and and do something about it. And yes, and whoever it may be. It doesn't mean that we agree theologically. They weren't all straightened out theologically, I'm sure. They didn't have the knowledge that Paul had or whoever was talking to them. But when God's grace is working, it's prevenient grace, and it may be saving grace, which is what God's trying to bring us all to in the world. But let's be sure our first reaction is encouragement and not trying to kill it. That's a principle which I think is critical to the way we work as Christians in the world. One of the most interesting parts of my experience in researching this area and in dealing with the Holiness Movement has been the European revival. As the revival in America began to grow, it began to spread. We have already said that Phoebe Palmer was in Europe during the Civil War. She was in England and having tremendous revivals among the various evangelical churches in England. And furthermore, there was a vast missionary network developed in the 19th century. As you know, missions spread all around the world, into India and China and all around. And these people were influenced by the revival. But no result of the revival outside of Methodism and outside the United States was greater than the Keswick revival. Now, when I say Keswick, I don't pronounce the W because that's the English pronunciation, Keswick. We've got a Keswick near me in Virginia, which they call Keswick, which is what it says. But, English is that crazy language where you don't always pronounce every letter you see, and that's what makes it so difficult. And so it's a silent W in English, Keswick. And let me tell you the story of Keswick, and it involves many lessons to be applied to our understanding of how the church works. Hannah Pearsall Smith and Robert Pearsall Smith, her husband, Hannah Whitall Smith and Robert Pearsall Smith, were two Quakers who got caught up in the Holiness Revival, as I said, around the time of the Civil War. They were both converted out of their Quakerism, which was quite a formal Quakerism, into an evangelical Quakerism in the revival of 1858. Hannah Whitall Smith, that's Whitall, not Whittle. I stayed with her great-granddaughter for 6 weeks and was going through the family papers, and she always kept telling me, not Whittle, Whitall. It originally had an E in Whitall, but Hannah Whitall Smith. And Robert Pearsall Smith were converted in the revival of 1858, and they were both sanctified in the course of the Holiness Revival at Vineland and beyond. They knew the NHA. They lived in Philadelphia. They were rather wealthy. Her father owned the large glass plant at Millville, New Jersey, and other places, which eventually became the Armstrong Cork Company, floor coverings and so forth, and a glass company, one of the big corporations of America a few years back. And so they had a little bit of money, and they were circulating in the Quaker class in Philadelphia. The Quakers owned much of Philadelphia in the 1850s and 60s. They were a small group, but they were wealthy. I said that Hannah Whitall Smith would have been born with a silver spoon in her mouth if the Quakers would have allowed it, but they were the plain folk. And so silver spoons were out, and sewing machines were out. They were a bit like the Amish in their restrictive lifestyle. They wore a separate dress. You know the man on the Quaker Oats barrel. That was the Quaker dress. The women had to wear the bonnet, much like the Amish wore the prayer bonnet. That's why history is so interesting. You find out all these things that match together and the influence of one over the other and why people do this. And so the Quakers were a plain people, but a very wealthy people and very influential because of their money. And but Quakerism was split. It had split 2 or 3 times between the beginning of the century and the Civil War in America and in England. The Hicksites and others were people that said the inner light was more important than the written word, and they split off, and other ites broke off. So Quakerism was in trouble. It was a troubled tradition in America. And the result was that the younger people in the movement, of which Hannah and her husband were, 2 of the younger leaders of prominent families in Quakerism in Philadelphia, they weren't happy with this. And they got influenced by the Methodist Holiness Revival. They had neighbors, and they knew the people from the NHA. They had them in their home. And so they gradually got sucked into the revival, and Robert, her husband, had a tremendous sanctification experience in which he said he felt like liquid glory had poured from the top of his head to his feet. One of the dramatic testimonies of the impressions he got, whether in the body or out of the body, as Paul said, when he was sanctified holy at the Vineland camp meeting. At the first big holiness camp meeting, he was one of those 20,000 people. And as a result, they got swallowed up in the work of the holiness revival. They were lay people, but they were used widely. She was able to speak. She was a capable writer and later on became one of the most famous Christian authors in the history, actually even up to today, most successful. She was a capable speaker. Now, Quakers did believe women could preach. They were not like the others that we talked about. They had women preachers. In fact, whoever had the impulse of the Spirit could speak. And so many times nobody spoke. Around this area where we knew the Quakers real well, we used to have the little saying, "Quaker meeting has begun, no more laughing, no more fun." Everybody got quiet, the quiet meeting. They just sat and waited for God to lead them. And we're going to see there was a lot of that in the Holiness Movement. The Church of God Anderson would not designate a preacher for a camp meeting. All the preachers would come and sit on the front seat with a text and a Bible in their hands, and then they would finally decide whom the Lord was leading to speak that day. Well, that didn't last very long, because that's really pushing the limitations of Spirit guidance. You know, ideally, it might be all right to say the Lord is going to let us know exactly who's going to do it, but you know, in holiness churches, we can't even sometimes vote on our pastor with any kind of objectivity. So we're still human, very human. But the Quakers believed that they would get word from God. But the problem was, nobody was getting a word from God except the old timers, because they were in control. Now I'm speaking, I'm inside the circle, so just let me stay there. Nobody could get control. And here were these young people who were anxious to do something for God, and she read about George Fox, the first Quaker, the founder, and she found out that he was a holiness person. She felt that he believed about the same thing Wesley did, and she found out that the Quakers were not preaching it, and so she became part, and her husband became part of the holiness revival. He was in the glass business with his family, with her family, and he went down to Millville, and it was there that she first heard about the Methodist blessing. Now, this is how revival works. She heard it from her seamstress. She was a wealthy Quaker, and she had a lady to make her dresses who certainly didn't have as much money as she did, but the person that made her dresses was a Methodist, a good shouting Methodist, as they used to say in those days. And one time when she was fitting Hannah for a dress, she told her about the wonderful prayer meeting they had had and how God had sanctified people and sanctified them holy. And that's the first witness she had to the Methodist message. And that would be like somebody getting really in our day, close to a Henry Ford or somebody like that, and getting into the family and teaching them the holiness message. That's about the level of separation between the groups. He was a mill owner, which in the 19th century was, because the aristocratic money class, and she was an employee, and so there wasn't much relationship normally between them. But they were Quaker and they were holiness, and they held meetings for their mill hands, as they were called, and had kind of a chaplain, which is now being done by a lot of American companies, I read the other day, are putting in chaplains for their workers. And so putting in chaplains, so they were advanced in some of these ideas. But they finally went down to the camp meeting at Vineland, which is not very far from Millville, New Jersey, and there they came under the full blast of the holiness revival with men like Inskip and Cookman, who was one of the greatest preachers in Methodism, who preached there, A.B. Simpson, who was bishop. And these men influenced them, and eventually he was dramatically sanctified. She never had that, just to take a little teaching on the doctrine itself. She struggled all her life because she never got the blessing in the way that he did. I shouldn't say all her life. She struggled for a long time because she believed that when the Spirit filled you, you ought to really know it, in the sense of being witnessed to by some physical thing. And by the way, there's where tongues comes in. On the Pentecostal side, there were a lot of people like that, who when you began talking the dynamic language of the Holy Spirit, they felt, well, if it's that dynamic, I ought to show it physically. It ought to have some physical representation. And I'm not arguing the case here, but that's where the Pentecostal witness of the tongues comes in. If the Spirit really falls on you, He will take over and do what He wants to do physically with you and vocally and so forth. And we'll talk about all of that later as to where we might stand doctrinally on that and where our problems are or aren't with that. But nevertheless, Hannah Whitehall Smith always looked for a dramatic baptism of the Holy Spirit. She writes a lot about it in her works. But then she finally decides, I'm never going to get it that way. She said she took it by simple faith. Amen. A la Palmer. Yeah. And that has to be taken into account. When we talk about Phoebe Palmer's teaching, there were many, many people that were bound to this dramatic idea of a witness, which had to be counteracted by the naked word, as she said. Phoebe Palmer said the naked faith. Sometimes you just have to take God by naked faith. He says the sun is shining, and it isn't. And you believe Him. He says He loves you, and it doesn't feel like it. And you believe Him. See, that's naked faith, and that's what Phoebe Palmer said we sometimes have to do. He says He will sanctify us, but it seems like it doesn't. She said, you've got to believe He wants to, and He will. And until He tells you otherwise, you hold on to God. That's the naked faith. And so Hannah Whitehall Smith took it by naked faith and finally decided that that's not the way God was going to work with her, but she believed God ultimately and completely. She held on to Him. And we're going to see that she went through some terribly trying times with that kind of faith, which wasn't really witnessed to by any great emotional excess of any kind, which many holiness people felt when they were filled with the Spirit. So they soon began to be used in the holiness work. And they became very popular. In fact, he wrote a little book, which we republished recently while I was still at Asbury, on the holiness message as it was understood by a Presbyterian. He became a Presbyterian. She never became anything but a Quaker. She left the Quaker church, but she never became a Methodist, which she preferred. She liked the Methodist trough, as we said in another tape here. But she never joined the Methodist church, and she finally went back to Quakerism. They were prominent enough that when they did something, of course, they were noticed. They were in the upper crust of society, but they were also just ordinary holiness lay people. They went to camp meeting and they pitched their tent and they were there and they took part in the services. But there was one great problem. Smith, Robert Pearsall, was a manic depressive individual. Now, I say that because of my research and because of what the family tells me. The family believes that. Now, you know, if you know any medical story about manic depression or manic affective diseases, it's basically that they're very hard to diagnose. It's like the childhood autism and that kind of thing. It's hard to tell where the boundary line is. But I am convinced, and the family is convinced that I talk with in the third generation down, that Smith was a manic depressive individual, and everything gives evidence of that. Now, you know that means that sometimes you're on an unbelievable high, and sometimes you're on an unbelievable low, and it can happen overnight. That's the nature of the disease. When I became convinced of this was by a medical analysis I heard over public radio while I was driving along one day for a whole hour, and as they kept talking, I thought, well, that's Smith, that's Smith, that's Smith. And let me tell you about it, because it's one of the tragic stories of evangelical evangelism. He got so bad at one point that he was so obsessive and so manic that they couldn't control him. In other words, he would go to meetings night after night after night. He'd preach every chance he got, and he was just going like a whirlwind. And Hannah, who thoroughly sympathized with his doctrine, but she just was worn out. She couldn't keep up with him. She couldn't control him. He was on a manic high. I'm not going to give you now my understanding, analysis of the situation. And some people would have said, well, the Spirit was giving him all these calls. Well, that may or may not be, but not to the destruction of his family and so forth. And so with the money they had, they went to his physician, and they said, what shall we do? And they said, send him on a trip up the Nile. There's nobody to preach to there. Now, that was a rather bold assumption, because if Smith had gotten up the Nile, he never did, but if he had gotten up the Nile, It's probably would have been trying to convert the Muslims and the Coptic Christians who are in Egypt. But nevertheless, he said, send him up the Nile. So with the family connections, remember this is a kind of a big business for the day, a major corporation of the time, a family business. They arranged with their bankers in London so that he could stop by London, pick up some money, and then, of course, England was in control of the Suez and all of that at that time, and he could sail up the Nile. But he had been so active in the United States in the holiness circles that the word had gotten over to England about this new Quaker evangelist that was in the movement, and his wife and family. When he got there, he met with his bankers, but some preachers hunted him down who were in the English revival. And they were not Wesleyan. They were basically a Presbyterian Congregational free church in the English system of churches, where you have the established church and then a lot of smaller evangelical churches. And they got a hold of him, and a committee said, if you will stay and teach us what you were teaching in the United States, what a deadly thing to say. If you will stay and teach us like they were teaching in the United States, we'll take charge of it, we'll make the arrangements, we'll get places for you to preach, and we'll hold breakfasts particularly. His first ones were breakfasts with ministers in which he told what God was doing in the holiness revival in the United States. And he was right at the heart of it. He knew basically what was going on. They got so excited. Here was a British Christianity that had kind of left old Calvinism behind, but they had never found anything to make up for it. And they had never heard about sanctification by faith. They believed in sanctification by kind of trial and error in the gradual process. And it just grabbed them. And of course, Smith was talking not in particular Methodist style, but he was talking in kind of a Presbyterian context in which he could talk about the higher life, about the victorious Christian life, which was another word used. And this just came like, the only way you can describe it in what happened in that brief time was like a bunch of hungry birds, little birds you see when the mother comes by with something she just caught and begins to feed them, and they all fight over it, and they try to get a gulp of it. That's about the reaction to Smith when he hit England. And pretty soon he was up at Oxford and held a meeting in the Corn Exchange at Oxford. And I've been there. It's still there, just like it was when he held these meetings in the early 1870s. That's the period we're talking about. And calls kept coming in, and calls kept coming in. He began contacting pastors. And the whole English religious system was suddenly looking to the holiness message as it was seen through this Quaker preacher's eyes, basically as a life which could be given by faith, in which we would live victoriously and not have to be sinning every day in thought, word, and deed, which was the common theology of that movement. We sin every day in thought, word, and deed. And salvation by faith. He started a paper and began to publish a paper in England. Now, this is when he's supposed to be going up the aisle. Up the Nile, rather, not up the aisle. Down the aisle, anyhow. Up the aisle. Up the Nile. And he's supposed to be there. Here he is, getting into the midst of one of the biggest revivals that Europe has ever had. And then they hear about him in Germany and in France and in Holland and in Switzerland. And one of them says, come on over to Germany. And he makes his way over to Germany. And they set him up in Switzerland. And by this time, the Methodists are in Germany, and the Evangelical Church of the United States is in Germany. They're small groups, so they supported him. He met in Paris with a lot of the Calvinistic leaders and told them about salvation by faith alone. He went to Holland. And Kuyper, who's one of the leading theologians of the later Calvinistic movement in Holland, and one of the leading Calvinist theologians, was a follower of Smith, and for a time helped him edit his paper. So he touched all levels of society. He got to Germany, where he was to preach in Berlin, and the little church, a pietistic church of Lutherans, which took him in, a kind of a chapel. This pietistic church couldn't hold him, so the emperor tells his chaplain to give Smith his chapel. So he uses the emperor's church in Germany. And remember, this is in 1871, just after the Franco-Prussian War stopped, and France and Germany are at each other's throats, and one's mad at the other because Germany won and France was subjected. And all of this is seething, and all these people are looking for some spiritual answer to these great problems which they have. And he goes through Germany in a triumphal tour. It's unbelievable, because if you know Germany and know German Christianity, and especially in that time, remember, this has the established church. The Lutheran Church was the established church of Germany, and and here this Methodist Quaker, Manic, is coming in and making the circuit, and 5,000 and 6,000 and 7,000 people, and a lot of them pastors, and some of the prominent theologians of Germany are sitting down and listening to him. He's a layperson, not a preacher. He's a layperson. And of course, she is not with him at this time. She can't catch up with him. And I'm not overdoing that. I mean, that's a little bit of the excitement. He has a song leader, which is one of the great song leaders of Germany, and I met that man's son in a meeting recently in Denmark. Or grandson rather, in a meeting recently in Denmark. It just fell together. It's one of the greatest examples of revival that you ever have seen. In fact, Warfield from Princeton, Dr. Drury, Warfield, who was an opponent of the movement, an opponent of Finney and revivalism, Warfield says it was the greatest splurge, he uses that word, or surge of something of revivalism since the apostles in so short a time. More people and more activity was generated. He was kind of like a shooting star. Well, it was so successful that the German pastors and other pastors said, we have to have a meeting of pastors. Already they had had meetings at Broadland's estate, which was the estate of Lord and Lady Mount Temple, who were relatives of the Queen, and they had built a special kind of camp meeting wing on this big old English plantation to have dormitory rooms for students from Cambridge and Oxford to come down so that they could hear the message that Smith was preaching. And for 10 years they held a kind of summer camp meeting at that big estate, which is the place where Princess Di and her husband Charles had their honeymoon, and where the Queen and Philip had their honeymoon. Amazing story. Just another level of holiness activity at a different level of class, but also taking in the common people of England. And so, as a result, they decided that they must have this big meeting in which Smith would talk to 10,000 pastors, hopefully, of Europe. Something like Billy Graham did in his Amsterdam meetings, very close to it. The largest meeting of Christians, pastors, ever, I guess, in the history of the Christian church at that time. And so it was set up, and we'll have to conclude here, our tape is running out. It was set up for Brighton, which is a beach, a popular beach resort in England, and the place where the royals had their playground. They built a playground there, kind of a big amusement park for the royal sons, and they got rental of that, and about 10,000 people, mostly pastors and mostly church leaders, came together at Brighton in July of 1874, I believe, to meet, I'm not sure that day, 74, 75, to meet, to hear Smith, and by that time he had called her over, and she was convinced that maybe the Lord was in it and it wasn't all manic depression, and the result was the Great Brighton Convention was held, and we'll have to tell you more about that and its effect upon England and the results which came from this crazy spell of evangelism by a very prominent, wealthy layperson in the early part of the last half of the 19th century.